Power in a royal homestead is measured in doors who is allowed to approach, who must wait, who is turned away with a nod that carries the weight of law. Shaka understood this like a soldier reading terrain. He locked the door of the war road so campaigns moved only at his signal. He controlled the council door so only the voices he trusted could cross the threshold. He even mastered the shadowed door where knives ask their questions. Yet one door he never opened. The doorway to a queen, the doorway to a cradle, the line that makes a prince. That refusal was not shyness, nor a quirk, but an architectural choice. With no wife and no child, he denied his house a second court and the mesh of in-laws that trail behind ceremony. To see why the prince's door stayed sealed, we must weigh three forces at once: policy, culture, and palace access. Policy drilled men and calendars into a single rhythm. Culture wrapped that discipline in taboos and ritual distance, turning a man into a sovereign. The palace translated both into access, because in any crawl, the right to draw near is the right to shape a day's decisions. The gain was immediate speed, focus, a state that could turn on a heel. The cost was delayed succession left undefined, a vacuum that could draw whisperers and blades. A prince is never only a child. He is a banner stitched in advance, gathering cattle and promises long before he touches the red earth on his own. The moment a queen is chosen, the air around the reed screens changes. Uncles from her side arrive to be remembered. Elders expect their mats to be laid. Allies angle for guardianship, and oaths are offered in the old language of gifts. A jar of beer poured at the right doorway, a herd shifted from one valley to the next, a praise name breathed near the screen. Each act tugs the house toward a future verdict. Court life does not wait for the baby. It organizes around him, as if a drum is already beating inside the womb and everyone means to keep time. Marriage, then, is not a private vow. It is an import license for another government. A bride brings more than beauty and beadwork. She carries a second cord on her back, brothers who will not sit in the outer ring, elders who expect to be heard, messengers who learn the shortest path between a grievance and a royal ear. Doors multiply. The gate to the queen's quarters becomes a point of leverage. The man who stands there often enough at dawn becomes more than a kinsman. He becomes a broker of hours and audiences. In a palace, a broker need not carry papers. He carries presence. The palace is a geography of thresholds. Every new doorway needs a guard. Every guard becomes a potential go-between, and every go-between writes his version of the story when the house is quiet. Shaka read that geography with a commander's eye. He knew that an heir is leverage that can be carried in a shawl, that a smile offered in the right ritual can turn into a seat near the fire, that the path from courtyard to hut is a sentence with commas where someone may interrupt you. The more in-law corridors you build, the more places a rival can wait. To accept a queen would be to accept new lanes for patronage to travel, new moments for access to tilt the scale. To name a prince would be to name a faction with a heartbeat. Where cattle can count like votes and gifts travel like signals, a royal infant is a beacon that draws ships you did not send. There was, too, a watcher skilled in this arithmetic, Mkabayi, the king's aunt. She could count cattle like coins and doors like lines on a map. She had seen succession turn on who stood nearest the reed screen when decisions were whispered. She understood that a marriage can be a floodgate, and that once opened it does not respect old irrigation channels. Her craft was simple and severe. Keep the king's house from drowning in the water a queen's kin would bring. Shaka's answer to the inheritance trap was severer still. He would not merely step around it, he would rearrange the ground. At dawn, the marching ground breathed like a drum. Young men moved as one body, feet packing the earth, shields tilting and locking in rhythms that could be read across a valley. This was not parade for show. It was the architecture of a state built from breath and sinew. Shaka's genius lay here, in the ibutho system, where cohorts were taken up together, drilled together, praised together, and, crucially, withheld together from the ordinary gravity of homestead life. He turned the desire for a household into a lever, and the lever into law. Marriage would come, but not when a family wished it, nor when a sweetheart's parents counted the cattle. It would come when the king said the season had turned. A regiment given its name is given a life song's honors, a skin of identity that keeps a man from scattering under pressure. They learned the intimacy of battle, how to bind a rival's shield and drive the short ikilwa where it matters, how to break and reform on command, how to feel a captain's glance like a tug on a rope. And in the evenings, when the dust settled along the kraal fence, they learned something quieter than any thrust: how to be content without a wife. That lesson was not sermon but schedule. A man without in-laws can march at sunrise. A man without a bride wealth to negotiate can cross a river without asking leave. Delay marriage and mobilization moves at the speed of a shout. Policy carried 1,000 small consequences that added up to power. By postponing the right to set up a homestead, Shaka cut away the most stubborn anchor in any campaign. The pull of fields, harvest timings, bride cattle not yet delivered, and the uncle who insists on a visit because his standing depends on it. The state did not abolish those claims. It put them on pause. In that pause, regiments could be fed from central herds, orders relayed without detour, the attention of the young pooled where a single voice could catch it and aim it like a spear point. Even the economy of affection was redirected. Songs that would have courted a girl now courted a praise name. Pride in a newborn hut was replaced by pride in a line that held when the dust was thickest. The delay did not deny manhood. It staged it, so that the first house a warrior raised was the house of the king. The symbol of a rival permission to wear the Isakoko head ring, to move from youth to settled strength, became a royal gift rather than a family milestone. Permission to marry was no longer the automatic fruit of age. It was a signature from the center, timed to the needs of the realm. That stroke did more than ration happiness. It rationed alliances. A cohort released to marry would scatter just enough to loosen its tight weave. A cohort held back stayed taut, sleeping under the same sky and answering the same call. Such a policy cannot stand if it is preached only outward. Men count their rulers' footprints as carefully as their own, searching for the hypocrisy that rots discipline from within. Shaka understood that authority which asks for sacrifice must wear the same mark. He refused the exemption that would have made his law a lie. If regiments were to deny themselves for the sake of speed and cohesion, then the man who commanded them would deny himself as well. This mirror did not soften him. It hardened the myth into trust. They obeyed not merely because they feared his temper or admired his victories, but because the rule that bound their longing bound his. In that reflection lay a particular kind of legitimacy, harsh, austere, undeniable. It also kept the corridors short. With no rush of new in-laws, there were fewer requests at the palace gates, fewer uncles learning the rhythm of guard changes, fewer visits that turned into petitions, fewer petitions that hardened into claims. The ibutho machine produced shock on the field and quiet in the passageways of power. By holding back marriages, Shaka held back the spread of keys. The door that leads to a prince, the widest door a monarch can open, stayed closed because the house was not admitting new wings at all. And yet marriage is a public gate as much as a private act. Open it, and you admit not only a wife but her brothers, her elders, her messengers, and a future that gathers in a cradle. Palace mathematics cares for such things. Guard posts, visiting hours, cattle allocations, seating orders, ritual privileges. Change one value and the rest must shift. This is how a second court forms not by proclamation, but by proximity. Patronage travels the routes that feet are allowed to take. Where a queen's kin can walk, cattle can be promised. Where they may wait without interruption, favors can be shaped into obligations. A cup of beer poured on the right mat becomes a request to rotate a guard. A nephew's posting, a gentle suggestion that the next council include a voice from the queen's side. None of it looks like conspiracy. All of it looks like kin doing what kin have always done. But a state that relies on tight approach will feel each new lane the way a canoe feels a passenger shift. Gatekeeping gives those shifts their teeth. Access is the grammar of authority. Change the doorkeeper and you change the sentence. 3 names stand close to that grammar. Dingane, who could wait like a stone and move like a cat when the path cleared. Mlangana, whose restlessness felt the air for opportunity. And Mbofa, whose hands knew the weight of decisions once they ceased to be words. They did not need long speeches to make weather. They counted doors and faces at those doors, the moments when a guard's eyes narrowed or relaxed. They learned when a message should arrive to feel like a solution rather than a problem. Add a queen and those arts move closer to the center. Subtract her and they remain at the margin, watching for other openings. The ledger returns. In one column lies marriage, clearer succession, softer edges on a hard rein, a domestic picture that reassures neighbors that tomorrow has a face. Beneath that headline run the costs: an imported network of approach, new doors to mind, new men whose access can tilt a day's decisions by degrees until the horizon moves. In the other column lies refusal: no queen, no prince, no second court. Mobility kept crisp, obedience kept focused, corridors as short as a shouted order, as quiet as a sealed hut. Beneath that headline waits the future cost: a fog where a name should be, a vacuum into which brothers will lean, and loyalists will decide, on a night of pressure, to become deciders. Shaka chose the second column with open eyes. Understanding motive requires more than mechanism, and explanation needs a conscience. Policy casts a human shadow. Solitude can be a discipline chosen before it becomes a fate. Nights after triumph have their own silence. A king inside a reed screen can hear a small fire asking for more wood, can feel the temptation to keep the center undivided. Ritual, too, has its say. In many homesteads, the sovereign's body is a shrine. Approach is purchased by right, made safe by abstention, time to a calendar that keeps rain in season and cattle in their fatness. Distance is not contempt, it is scaffolding. In that slow language, no wife, no child may read less like a wound than a vow. Stories about such a figure never agree in full. Missionaries, officials, poets, and later historians carry their own horizons to the page. If numbers conflict, we read for pattern as a hunter reads spoor, as a captain reads ripples on a river whose bed he cannot see. Across voices that disagree, certain lines persist. Marriage delayed by design, permission to found a homestead rationed from the center, access structured by rank and rhythm. The palace thinks in thresholds. Narratives that cannot explain how a request crossed from the outer circle to the inner without tripping a rule do not hold. Those that show calendars, guard lists, and rites that tightened approach, we keep. By that pattern, the prince's door remains our firmest fact. Sealed in discipline, stiffened by ritual, and defended by the arithmetic of access. A throne without a cradle leaves the night crowded with possibilities. After the morning drums for Nandi, the palace settled into a brittle quiet that would not last. There was no small heartbeat to gather loyalties, no queen's quarters to soak up 1,000 private ambitions. The corridors carried whispers as the wind carries ash. Guard tokens moved hand to hand with the care of men who know timing is a weapon. At Kwadukuza, where reed screens hold conversations as a calabash holds water, the vacuum began to pull. Brothers felt it first. They always do. A succession that might have run straight through a sleeping child now curved through doorways and watchposts, through the patience of men who understood that, in a house arranged by access, the shortest distance to power is measured in paces, not in blood alone. Messages moved before any spear did. A nod at the morning gate became a courier by noon. A captain told to hold the inner ring yesterday was told, with the same calm voice, to hold his men just outside it today. A praise singer shifted a stanza by a breath, letting one name fall earlier than it had before. None of it was loud enough to be treason, all of it exact enough to be preparation. Ibutho captains counted shields, not because they were summoned to the rim of the valley, but because they were summoned to readiness. Loyalty in a soldier's life is often the art of recognizing when a new order belongs to the same house as the old. The corridor where it happened was narrow, not for metaphor, but because royal huts are built to hold private air. A narrow space gathers decisions, excludes spectators, and shortens the distance between resolve and act. Near dusk, when heat leaves the ground and cattle settle, footsteps came with the confidence of men who had stood in that passage 1,000 times in service, and would stand once more in decision. 3 knocks, neither hurried nor timid, told the reed what it needed to know. The screen parted as it had parted for counsel and return from campaign. Steel whispered, because steel always whispers in close quarters. There are no speeches at such moments, only the discipline of hours collapsing into an instant. What moved outward from that passage was the quick grammar of legitimacy. Word ran through the homestead like water finding its levels. Threshold keepers lifted a hand for calm. Disorder is expensive and mourning must be paid for. Captains who had spent years learning that their lines move when the center breathes called their ibutho to stand no charge, no pursuit. Only the posture of bodies turning toward a new voice. In that posture, oaths are taken. Insignia is not torn off in theater, it is set down. A new mark is lifted with the gravity of men who know a shield's face can be a flag and a timetable at once. A phrase is added to a praise name, a bead pattern bound to a wrist, and the state records the change without ink because the dust remembers where feet stood at sundown. By morning, the palace had new habits. The guard at the inner gate greeted a familiar elder with a different tilt of the head. The schedule of audiences found a new hinge. Runners into the outer homesteads took the same paths but spoke different names with their last breath. This is succession where no heir has been cradled. Not a parade of tiny feet to a tiny stool, but a reweaving of approach. An almost imperceptible turning of faces toward the man now seated where decisions gather. It is brutal precisely because it is efficient. The realm is spared a war of cousins at the price of a single concentrated night. The verdict that rises is not celebration. It is a reckoning with the ledger Shaka kept from the day he tightened the calendar of marriage. He won a present tense of astonishing clarity, regiments that moved like thought, orders that did not tangle in in-law disputes, a palace whose doors admitted no second court. He paid, at last, in the only currency the future accepts from such a reign, a vacuum that others must fill at speed or the state will stumble between breaths. If the crown will not pass through sleep, it will pass through hinges, and the men who have learned their weight will be the ones to bear it. Imagine for a moment another line drawn through the house, a small name spoken early, a child ringed with praise and protocol, a queen whose brothers soak up the restless energies that otherwise prowl at thresholds. With a prince in the cradle, the palace would have breathed in a different rhythm. Alliances would have begun in daylight, argued over cattle and counsel rather than time to guard rotations. Campaigns might have moved a shade slower as in-law obligations tugged at the calendar, but succession would have hardened into a path men could see and prepare to walk without sharpening the night. The same gates we have watched so closely would have taken on other duties: more ceremony, more mediation, fewer chances for a single corridor to decide a reign. The price of speed would have been paid back as safety, the spear point traded for the steady pull of a rope drawn by many hands. Shaka chose otherwise, and the choice kept its promise. It made a present that was fierce and clean, and wrote a future that had to be seized rather than inherited. To read his reign honestly is to hold both truths: the brilliance of a state tuned to one signal, and the cost of leaving no bridge between signals except men who knew the doors. So, the question returns to the scale where we first set it. When you weigh the sealed prince's door, its discipline, its austerity, its consequences, what sits heaviest? Strategy, the deliberate architecture of power? Trauma, a private weather hardened into policy? Taboo, the ritual distance that guarded the sovereign's body and aura? Give the verdict and the reason. Then step with us into the next chamber of this story, where the map of access is drawn by the Kingmaker who counted cattle like coins and doors like lines on a palm. Mkabayi's playbook is waiting.